Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Marty Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, Volume 2, also known as Sha Lang by Priest, and we are actually getting into the final arc of this volume. That is Arc 7, A Nation in Crisis, and I'm super excited because after this video, there is just one more, and then we will officially be on Volume 3. So, let's go ahead and get started because I need to know what happens next. Arc 7, A Nation in Crisis. Chapter 56, Muted Thunder. Chang Geng chased after Gu Yun. Yifu, wait! Gu Yun, already astride his horse, glanced down from his high perch. His warhorse was as anxious as its rider, and though Gu Yun kept a firm grip on the reins, it paced impatiently in place. All the blood in Chang Geng's face seemed to have migrated to the palms of his injured hands and the crimson edges of his sleeves, as if he were an ink portrait drawn on paper. His expression, however, was almost apathetic, as if he had pasted a mask over that face that had been so pained just seconds ago. Chang Geng said, every word deliberate. If Uncle Hua fails to keep General Tan in check, Yifu, you will invite disaster upon yourself by returning to the capital now. Gu Yuan's graceful eyebrow jumped slightly. He opened his mouth to speak, but Chang Geng cut him off. I know. Even if you invite disaster upon yourself, you will return to the capital, because the Imperial Guard is no match for the northern camp. Aside from Yifu, there isn't a single other person who can keep General Tan in check. If a rebellion were to rock the capital, the consequences would be unimaginable. Chang Geng sucked in a deep breath, then stretched a bloody hand toward Gu Yun. But if His Majesty detains you, the generals on all four borders will doubtless become uneasy. That, too, may lead to disaster. Yifu, give me a token that will reassure the hearts of the people. Shock flickered across Gu Yuan's face. This child, who had just been vexing him so thoroughly, felt suddenly unfamiliar. Everyone wears many faces. Some wield authority with legendary might in public, yet transform into a small child around their closest family, forgetful, fickle, and ignorant of the ways of the world. Chang Geng was growing further and further from that boy who had rebelliously called his young godfather Shirliu, but relied on him at every turn. Yet still, the admiration and reliance he felt toward Gu Yun lingered in his heart. Even if his affection stirred in more passionate directions in the middle of the night, this paternal or fraternal facet of their relationship gave the whole affair a touch of taboo. And so it would, until the easterly winds of change scattered the last remaining fragments of his youthful sentiments. Chang Geng was rapidly realizing that he was on the verge of stepping alone onto a road where no one would understand him, and no one would accompany him. From now on, he was no longer anyone's son, nor a child of anyone's younger generation. Gu Yuan took out his personal seal and tossed it to Chang Geng. This doesn't carry the same weight as the Black Iron Tiger Tally, he said, but all veterans of my command will recognize it. It may be of some use. If it comes down to it, think of some way to contact old General Zhong. Chang Geng didn't even look at the seal before tucking it away within his sleeve. I understand. Yifu needn't worry, he said with a slow nod. He had hardly finished speaking before Gu Yuan dug his heels into his horse's flanks and galloped off into the distance. Chang Geng stared at his retreating back until it disappeared from sight. He suddenly squeezed his eyes shut and murmured, Zuxi. The Marquis Estate guard standing beside him didn't hear him clearly. He asked in confusion, Your Highness, what did you say? Chang Geng spun around. Prepare a brush and paper. Your Highness, your hands. The guard chased after him. Chang Geng paused, picked up Gu Yuan's abandoned jar of wine, and, with no change in expression, poured a whole jar of strong liquor over the wounds on his hands. The cuts, which had already begun to scab over, bled again with the rush of liquid. Chang Geng carelessly retrieved a handkerchief from his lapels and wrapped them tight. In the capital, no one expected that an old eunuch's death would raise such a storm of controversy. The resentment Tan Hongfei had suppressed for 20 years erupted. He had very likely already lost his mind. He first sent soldiers to surround Imperial Uncle Wang's estate. Upon learning that the old bastard had abandoned his wife and children to cower within the palace, he did an about-face and brazenly turned his blade on the Imperial Guard who had rushed to the scene. The Imperial Guard and the northern camp had always been the last lines of defense for the capital, one within and one without, and the two constantly crossed paths. The Imperial Guard was, by and large, made up of two groups: young master soldiers benefiting from nepotism and living off imperial coffers, and elite soldiers selected from the northern camp. The former had already pissed their pants in terror and could not be relied on. The latter were skilled, but stuck in the impossible position of drawing blades against their maiden family, quickly crumbled. Just as Chang Geng had predicted, in no time at all, the Imperial Guard was defeated. Music and song from Kite's Flight Pavilion still echoed through the halls, and white steam from heated jars of flour and wine had yet to disperse, but the capital city had erupted into pandemonium. Tan Hongfei and his men advanced right up to the restricted area of the imperial palace. The general plucked off his helmet as if he were holding his own hand in his arms and performed 3 bows and 9 kowtows in the direction of the great hall. He bellowed at the imperial guard blocking his way. "This guilty subject, Tan Hongfei, requests an audience with His Majesty. May His Majesty hand over the conniving traitor taking shelter within the palace walls and offer a proper explanation for all my comrades who fight in defense of our nation, and to all under heaven. This guilty subject is willing to die 1,000 deaths for the crime of forcing his sovereign's hand." When his words were relayed to Li Feng inside the palace, the emperor, who hadn't even gotten around to blaming Wang Guo, flew instantly into a rage. Wang Guo had fled with his tail between his legs, but the Son of Heaven was made of much sterner stuff. Li Feng almost smashed the imperial jade seal in his fury. Brushing off all his attendants' counsel, he tossed a robe over himself and turned to leave, striding through the doors of the great hall to face Tan Hongfei in person. The massive forces of the nation's capital and the imperial bodyguards of the emperor's palace gazed at each other across dozens of meters of white marble steps. Even the sparrows perched on the palace walls began to sweat with nerves. Guyuan arrived on the scene just in time to witness this dangerous standoff. Guyuan had brought only 20-some men with him. They had carved a path through the northern camp troops encircling the imperial palace and charged straight in. At the sight of this confrontation, the enraged Marquis of Anding nearly spat up a mouthful of heart's blood. He strode forward and lashed his whip across Tan Hongfei's face, leaving a bloody gash. "Are you looking to die?" he roared. The rims of Tan Hongfei's eyes reddened at the sight of Guyuan. "Marshal, shut up! What are you trying to do? Force His Majesty to abdicate?" Guyuan kicked Tan Hongfei in the shoulder, practically stumping him into the ground. "Do you still have any deference in your heart? Any loyalty? Do you understand the hierarchy between lord and subject? What about the rule that the soldiers of the northern camp are not to enter the capital city without a summons? Who gave you the guts to rebel against your superiors?" Tan Hongfei sprawled on the ground, sobbing through his words. "Sir, it's been 20 years. Our brothers who died in vain. Our brothers who have yet to be avenged." Guyuan looked down at him, eyes cold as ice and just as unmoved. "Order all members of the northern camp to withdraw beyond the 9 gates within the hour. If you are late by a second, I'll cut you down myself. Scram! Marshal, get out!" The corner of Guyuan's eye throbbed incessantly. Kicking Tan Hongfei away, he stepped forward, flipped up the hem of his robes, and knelt before the stone steps of the great hall. "Peace, Your Majesty. General Tan acquired inquiries in his youth and has long suffered from bouts of insanity. He was instigated by malicious parties and must have been momentarily possessed, causing his illness to flare. On account of his many years of meritorious and tireless service, please spare this lunatic and send him home to recuperate." Du Xiaojiao took the chance to whisper into Li Feng's ear. "Your Majesty, you see, The marshal is here too. You mustn't take any risks with your venerated body. Why don't you step away and head inside for now?" Li Feng laughed in fury and turned to look at Zhu Xiaojiao. When he spoke, his voice was frosty. "What? He's your marshal now too?" Zhu Xiaojiao's face went deathly pale, and he dropped to his knees with a thud. Li Feng stood on the white marble steps with his hands behind his back, gazing down at the Marquis of Anding in his black iron light pelt armor. He finally understood one thing. Why it was that, before the late emperor passed, he had grabbed Li Feng's hand and exhorted him to beware a certain individual, not the ambitious Prince Wei, nor the covetous foreigners, but his very own right hand, Gu Yun. An hour later, the northern camp had retreated beyond the 9 gates. Including Tan Hongfei, 9 senior officers involved in the incident were thrown behind bars, along with the Marquis of Anding. At the same time, countless wooden birds rose from the hot spring villa in the northern outskirts. Light cavalrymen galloped along 2 different routes, each carrying a letter stamped with Gu Yuan's personal seal. Dressed in civilian clothes, they rushed toward the northwest and the east sea coast in Jiangnan, 2 vital regions along the border. If Chang Geng had even 1 or 2 Black Hawks on hand, perhaps he would have stood a chance. But when the long-gone emperor confiscated Gu Yuan's seal of command, he had sent every last one of his Black Iron Battalion soldiers back to the northwest garrison. Once again, they were too late. At the jewel that was the entrance to the Silk Road in the western regions, currently abloom with a beautiful flush of spring, the flourishing scene of several months ago was no more. Every border pass was barred. The Black Iron Battalion stood by in full battle array, lethal black crows as far as the eye could see. He Ronghui was under orders to stand as acting commander of the 3 divisions, and the marching orders decree gathered dust on his desk. It was a thickly overcast day, and black clouds loomed low over the city. Each nation's garrison had their gates sealed, and all was silent. It was as if this field of yellow sand was waiting for a single spark to set it aflame. Perhaps General He was overthinking. He was struck with a sense of foreboding. Something was about to happen. A Black Hawk suddenly dropped from the sky. The man missed his footing on the landing and tumbled into the western region's sandy dust. A Black Iron light-pelt cavalryman who happened to be passing on patrol saw and hurried to investigate. That aerial assassin, Lord of the Skies, seemed to buckle under the weight of his Black Hawk armor. He knelt on the ground, clutching his comrade's hand in a vice grip. Beneath his visor, his youthful face was terrifyingly wan. The captain of the patrol hurried over. "Didn't General He order you to the capital to inquire when the marshal would recover his seal of command? What is it? What exactly is going on?" he asked, rapid fire. The Black Hawk clenched his jaw. Blood oozed from between his teeth. His handsome face twisted as he tugged the hawk armor off his body. Hoarsely, he said, "I need to speak with General He." With the northern camp incident barely ended and Tan Hongfei imprisoned, the 9 Gates infantry commander feared news of the Marquis of Anding's detainment would incite still greater turmoil. After taking over the northern camp's defensive duties, the first thing he did was send his men to seal every entrance to the capital and its surroundings. The Black Hawk sent by He Ronghui was still airborne when he was met with a volley of Parhelion arrows. After a harrowing struggle to shake off the barrage, he landed in disguise and finally gleaned the shape of the situation from rumors bubbling among the common people. Infuriated, the Black Hawk had turned around and winged straight back to the northwest, passing the light cavalryman Chang Geng had dispatched to He Ronghui on his way. A Black Hawk was much faster than a horse. He arrived at the Black Iron Battalion's garrison several days ahead of the rider. The powder keg called He Ronghui exploded on the spot. That very night, he led his men to storm the Protectorate of the Northwest. At the same time, the sand tigers that had assembled in Chutsa slowly rolled out of their encampment and raised their heads, turning their pitch-black muzzles to the east. Every party had done all that was humanly possible. The rest was up to fate. How unfortunate that fate had utterly abandoned the House of Lee, whose destined years were running out. In the wastelands of the northern frontier, where a second chill had descended after a sudden warm spring, the ring of the winding mountain range curved in a gentle arc, and eager wildflowers pushed up wave upon wave of buds. A pack of gray wolves stood high on a hill. Hunting hawks screeched as they wheeled through the air, and a dusty, oil-stained flag whipped in the wind beside flapping animal skins. The endless sky was azure above. The vast earth was black and yellow below. And deep within the thick grasses stood an army of thousands. Amid the cold iron and the roar of machinery, a voice was raised in a hoarse yet tender song. The purest spirit of the grasslands, even the heavenly winds seek to kiss the hem of her skirt. All living creatures sing along. All living creatures bow their heads. They kneel on the land where she sings and dances. These lands in the coming year will flock with cattle and sheep. They will flourish with lush vegetation. They will bloom with a carpet of flowers that stretches to the edge of the mountains of heaven. In the coming year, there shall be eternal sky and evergreen grass. Wild hares shall creep out from their burrows. Wild horses shall return. In the blink of an eye, it had already been 5, nearly 6 years. Jia La Yinghuo, the northern barbarian crown prince who, spurred by rage, had brashly launched ahead on attack on Yanhui town, had now inherited the 18 tribes and become the true Wolf King. The northwest winds beyond the pass had etched his fate with lines deep as if cut by a blade, and thousands of days and nights had fallen like carving knives upon his visage, his very bones steeped in hatred and resentment. Now the hair at his temples was streaked with white, and the murderous gleam in his eyes had been neatly stored away in his heart, not a hint discernible on his face. The expansive reaches of his song had also gathered dust. He only crooned a couple of verses, familiar lyrics from that familiar song, but his voice had already grown rough. He raised the wine flask at his waist and swallowed a mouthful of unfiltered liquor from the lip, tasting rust. His eyes were turned to the sky, locking on a soaring figure approaching from a distance, and his face was tense. Flying wing to wing with the hunting hawks, the black figure swiftly closed in, and a suit of hawk armor, larger than that of the black hawks and far more ferocious in appearance. The soldier careened in with a shrill screech, alighted before the Wolf King, and presented with both hands a small golden arrow fashioned of some unknown material. Jia La Yinghuo picked up that small arrow and poured his wine over its surface. A line of text in the 18 tribes script gradually appeared on the once glossy shaft. Those slender and arching characters spread beneath the strong liquor, forming words. May the Wolf King take the first step. Jia La Yinghuo sucked in a breath. He once thought that when this day finally arrived, he would be overcome with a wild glee. But it was not so. Only now did he discover that, after so many years, hatred had left him hollow. His chance to turn the tables was close at hand, but he had forgotten how to laugh with joy. The reigning Wolf King looked up at the boundless sky and was rendered dizzy by the light of the sun. It was as if the eyes of the dead in their countless pairs were staring straight at him. "It's time," he murmured, and raised a hand. His army of thousands fell silent. He swung his hand violently down. The gray wolves howled at the skies. They charged down from the hills, turning their claws toward the south. On the archipelagos of the south, where warm winds wailed through evergreen foliage, a large ship, black from prow to stern, sailed into a tranquil, rough-hewn harbor. Before the ship was solidly moored, a crowd of warriors bearing armor and weapons had already opened the doors and poured from the cabin. The uninhabited little island was instantly awash with light. Rows upon rows of battle armor was arrayed amid the colossal rock formations like an ominous army of ghostly soldiers, visors sinister in the faint glow of fire. Amid the ranks of heavy armor, an enormous military map was displayed, delineating every last secret tunnel within the southern border's mountain ranges. The 64 Gu Yuan had dug up were merely the tip of the iceberg. Finally, in the once peaceful East Sea, snake-like ninja and Dongying warriors wielding long sabers disguised themselves as coastal Woku pirates and furtively rowed across the ocean in tiny boats, undetected, communicating with each other using strange gestures. They streamed in from all directions and slowly gathered like teeming ants. The cargo ships that ordinarily flowed in and out like water slid out of Great Liang's harbor one by one, then silently turned toward the islands of Dongying. A long and piercing blast from a steam whistle sounded over the boundless ocean, and the merchant ships gathered in neat formation, their movements orderly and severe. As they cleared the cruising range of the Jiangnan Navy, the ship at the head of the formation struck its merchant flag. In its place, the Western Pope's austere and heavy battle flag ran up, towering above the ocean surface and casting a long shadow in its wake. The swapping of the flag was some sort of frightful cue. Each of the enormous merchant ships began to disassemble themselves. Their outer layers, used to effect an illusion of peace, sloughed off into the sea, revealing row after row of pitch-black cannon muzzles beneath. These were dragon ships such as the world had never seen. They were small and peculiar in their construction. They could be wrapped in a shell of an ordinary merchant ship, but they sailed as fast as lightning and moved like sea monsters, leaving gales in their wake as they cut through the surf. Signal flags conveyed orders, and this swarm of monsters dispersed. A giant black shadow rose inexorably from beneath the waters. A wave like a small mountain surged from the once still surface of the sea. What emerged was an enormous beast, unparalleled in size. It broke the surface, revealing a grotesque head and countless suckers, to which thousands of armed and ready sea dragons and warships were attached. Vertical columns atop the great beast were filled with violet gold, and its thick iron shell yawned open with a turning of countless interlocked gears to reveal rows of cannons in every size, their gaping muzzles like so many malevolent eyes swiveling without pause. This enormous sea monster would carry over a dozen of Great Liang's dragon ships on its deck. The cabin door slowly swung open. An inky black staircase seemed to unfurl from nowhere like a great tongue, and two ranks of Western sailors in curious little hats walked out single file. A black umbrella opened from within the black doorway and lifted to block the seawater streaming down from above. A man ducked his head and stepped serenely into its shelter. He was none other than the white-haired Westerner whom Gu Yuan had once encountered in the imperial palace. The figure holding the umbrella walked out a half-step behind. This was the very same Master Jia who had hung the southern border's bandits out to dry all those months ago. Chapter 57. A Nation in Crisis. Your Holiness, our preparations are now complete. Mr. Jia reached out to assist the white-haired man. This person, who had visited Great Liang numerous times, claiming to be an envoy, was in truth the Pope himself. Despite so many deviations from the plan along the way, with this result, your painstaking efforts have not been wasted here, said Mr. Jia. The Pope stared at the malevolent swarm of sea beasts floating on the ocean's surface, face placid. He did not look pleased at the sight. Rather, an indescribable trace of compassionate melancholy seemed to color his expression. It's early yet to discuss results, said the Pope. Fate is a mysterious thing. The fate of one person is already unpredictable. Never mind that of a nation. This, perhaps, is something only God knows. Mr. Jia laughed. Like when that idiot Jiala Yinghua couldn't resist temptation and revealed the truth of that incident to Gu Yuan ahead of schedule. Jiala Yinghua hated Gu Yuan, the last remaining member of the Gu family, too much. Other than this bit of hatred, he had practically nothing left in his life. He had long cast aside the dignity of the Wolf King and transformed into a mad dog with his sights locked only on his prize. In his eyes, so long as he could land a blow on Gu Yuan, he cared not for a wit whose plans he spoiled. Unfortunately, they had no choice but to cooperate with this mad dog. A grudge between the 18 tribes and the Central Plains, built up through generations of conflict, ran too deep, and the forces the goddess had buried within the capital city were too crucial to their plans. I truly admire Gu Yuan, Master Jia sighed. If I were him, I might have done nothing. But he actually dealt with it in absolute secrecy. If he hadn't, the situation would have spiraled even further out of control when we exposed the truth today. Perhaps the regional garrisons would have already, what do they call it? Rid the emperor of treacherous ministers? The Pope chuckled. The effect may not be ideal, but we've done all we can. The window of opportunity was brief, and we had little choice. Ja, every one of us is a trapped beast clawing toward survival. If we don't devour others, others will devour us. Countless pairs of eyes are watching the enormous plump herbivore that is Great Liang. We must make the move first. Otherwise, in 3 to 5 years, we may no longer have the strength for this battle. Mr. Jia looked out over the boundless ocean. All within view was water and sea and sky blurred into one. Your Holiness, he asked, still confused, if it is only an herbivore, why must we go to such effort to extract its claws and teeth? Herbivore or carnivore isn't determined by the shape of its body or its teeth and claws, the Pope muttered. The question is whether it feels greed, whether its heart hungers to gnaw, tear, and devour. Have you ever smelled this scent? Mr. Jia started in surprise. Violet gold of sufficient purity was practically odorless when it burned. Dogs in Gu Yuan were probably the only ones who could detect it. Your Holiness, do you mean the scent of the ocean? He ventured. It's a stench, child, the Pope said quietly. If the devil exists, then he is undoubtedly this tiny little oar. Since the day it broke through the earth, those violet flames have ignited this damned era. It has turned the children of God into the hearts of iron beasts. But weren't the machines that burned iron gold created by humans? Mr. Jia shrugged. He didn't reply, but neither did he quite take those words to heart. The Pope spoke no further. He merely lowered his head and kissed the ring on his hand, which was carved with the image of his staff. He spoke under his breath, murmuring a simple prayer. Forgive me, he whispered. Please forgive me. An azure blue signal flare rose from the dragon ship at the vanguard and shot into the sky. Its reflected fire seemed to burn in Mr. Jia's eyes. He made a great effort to remain calm, but could not completely suppress his surging excitement. Your Holiness, it's beginning! It was the 7th year of Longan, the 8th day of the 4th month, and the 3rd day after the Marquis of Anding, Gu Yuan had relocated from the hot spring villa to the imperial dungeons. The imperial dungeons were dark and gloomy, but fortunately, the capital was quite warm, the chill of winter having retreated after the onset of spring. The hay pile inside Gu Yuan's prison cell was softer than any army cot, so it was no trial to stay here for a few days. Gu Yuan viewed it as a holiday. Broken silence ruled his surroundings. He didn't have so much as a single cellmate with whom he could chat and brag about his achievements, and the prison guards were iron puppets who obviously couldn't speak. This was the innermost chamber of the imperial dungeons. Only members of the imperial family or their in-laws, high nobility, and eminent ministers and generals could enter. Someone like Tan Hongfei, the commander of the northern camp, hadn't even the right to be imprisoned there. The last person who had been qualified to grace these cells with his presence was the emperor's own brother, Prince Wei. Guyuan had the pleasure of being treated to his own private room, so alone he stayed. Had there been someone with whom he could converse, he wouldn't have been able to hear them anyway. The medicine he had hastily taken before his departure had long worn off, and the moles at the corner of his eye and on his earlobe had faded to near invisibility. He hadn't brought his glass monocule either, so his vision was barely sufficient to count the fingers on his own hand. Even the footfalls of the iron puppets clinking in and out sounded muffled to his ears. To pass the time, Guyuan caught a little rat to keep as a pet. He fed it a few bites from each of his meals and played with it when he was bored. Someone had dug up that incident on purpose. Guyuan was well aware of this. 5 years ago, when he had quietly looked into the matter, he had destroyed some of the most damning evidence. But he hadn't touched Wu He. First of all, the man was merely an old dog on his last legs. And second, perhaps Guyuan wasn't entirely unselfish and was reluctant to scrub every trace of the heart-rending truth from this world. Guyuan had to admit this was a misstep on his part. If back then he had been even half so steady and astute as he was now, he would have understood that his choices were to either gather up the evidence, wait until the time was ripe, and present it all at once as he rebelled outright, or to steel his resolve and burn every last trace of it to ash, burying the past in the past, and never allow a hint of this matter to see the light of day again. An absolute blunder. He had hesitated at a time when he should have been resolute. The Yuanhe emperor had been the same. If he hadn't been so indecisive, Guyuan would have long passed from this world. That would have resulted in a different kind of peace. As for what awaited in the aftermath of this incident, Guyuan didn't know. Nor did he know whether Chang Geng, a boy still wet behind the ears, really had the ability to reassure the nation's generals. But he was deep in the imperial dungeons. Worrying about it would do no good. Guyuan had little choice but to try to relax and conserve his energy. The rat, meanwhile, had discovered that this person had annoyingly mischievous hands. Unable to escape, it decided to play dead and ignore him henceforth. The little Marquis, beloathed of all animals, could only go sit listlessly against the cell wall and meditate. In fact, he found this rat's attitude rather like Chang Geng's when he was younger. As his mind wandered toward Chang Geng, Guyuan couldn't resist heaving a sigh. With the way he is now, I think I preferred it when he was little and always acted like I was getting on his nerves, he lamented to the rat. The rat showed him its round little rump. Guyuan sucked in a deep breath and shoved this momentary distraction from his mind. Uncaring of the filth, he dragged the moldering blanket from the hay pile and draped it over himself, then leaned back to rest his eyes. He would need all his strength to face the difficulties to come. No clamor in the world could be loud enough to disturb a half-dead man in the depths of the imperial dungeons, and Guyuan soon fell asleep. Wreathed in the gloomy scent of mildew, he had a dream. Guyuan dreamed that he was lying beneath a giant guillotine, a 1,000-kilogram blade pressed into his chest, biting into flesh and sinking into bone bit by bit as it cut him in two. He lost all connection with his body and limbs. Only the wound on his chest was left, burning with pain down to his core. His ears echoed with a cacophony of sounds, sobs, cannon fire, wails, and nearly inaudible, the halting and dissonant trill of a barbarian flute. He was split open by that heavy blade, but no blood seeped from the wound. Instead, a signal arrow tumbled out and screeched into the sky, shaking the earth with the force of its explosion. Guyuan started awake with a muffled groan. The old wound across his chest ached without reason, and the piercing shriek of the signal arrow in his dream echoed in his ears, stretching into a peculiar ringing hum. Perhaps he indeed had some mysterious connection with his Black Iron Battalion. For that very night, from within the Silk Road garrison in the western regions, the first ominous signal arrow burst into a vibrant explosion in the night sky. The emergency dispatch didn't reach the capital until the next day. The Black Hawk bearing the message arrived with only one leg remaining. he had endured on his last breath in order to reach the anxiety-stricken northern camp, but failed to utter a single word before he died, perishing almost the instant he landed. 4 hours later, news of an attack on the Black Iron Battalion in the western regions shook the court and commons. Several days ago, when the news of the incident in the capital had leaked, He Ronghui had rallied his men to surround the Protectorate of the Northwest. No one expected that the instant he left the garrison, Qiu Ci would strike. 160 sand tigers blasted through the black steeds encamped at the entrance to the western regions. War chariots, like sand tigers, were the greatest nemesis of the light-pelt armored cavalry. For a terrible moment, smoke and dust billowed through the air, lit by a veritable curtain of fire. War horses died with drawn-out screams, and armored cavalrymen fell in swaths. But the Black Iron Battalion was still the Black Iron Battalion. After a brief interval of disordered scrambling, they swiftly found their bearings. Black carapaces pushed the enemy back without the slightest hesitation, and once He Ronghui got the news, he immediately led the Black Hawk Division back the way they came and decisively cut off the Sand Tigers' supply lines from the air. Such giant war chariots burned enormous quantities of violet gold. With their supply lines cut, they became no more than piles of scrap metal. But the initial wave of sand tigers was no empty threat. Behind them was everyone's worst nightmare come true. An army tens of thousands strong, brandishing their banners toward the sky. Coming from their various garrisons, the far westerners, the kingdom of the western regions that had once rebelled, and even the Sindhu people who had long taken advantage of regional turmoil to skim off the top, the numbers were even greater than imagined. They may have been a motley horde, but they were a horde nevertheless. With sand tigers on the enemy's side, the Black Iron Battalion had no choice but to face them head-on with heavy armor. Victory soon became a matter of who had the larger stockpiles of violet gold. He Ronghui authorized the emergency use of the Western Region's camp's violet gold stores, but upon opening them, he stood in shock. The stores were already depleted. When the Longan Emperor cracked down on violet gold smuggling, Gu Yuan had been forced to pause his own secret operations. In the meantime, the amount of violet gold allocated to the Black Iron Battalion by the court was only enough to sustain regular patrols. It couldn't possibly see them through a sudden outbreak of war. He Ronghui sent his men to procure more, but they encountered yet more obstacles on their way. News of the Marquis of Anding's imprisonment had spread throughout the nation, but no one knew the details of the situation. Times were uncertain, and all sorts of rumors were in circulation. Who would be brave enough to supply violet gold to the Black Iron Battalion without a marching orders decree? What if their next step was to slay their way to the capital and start a rebellion? He Ronghui had no choice but to send Black Hawks to the capital while requesting backup from their closest allies in the Northern Border Defense Corps. But before the messengers could depart, the 18 tribes launched a surprise attack from beyond the pass. The news that the Wolf King Jialai Yinghua was personally leading an expedition south crashed down on the nation with a resounding bang. After 5 years of peace, the situation beyond the Iron Wall had undergone a complete transformation. Jialai Yinghua had assembled an army of tens of thousands of elite soldiers, almost 1,000 suits of heavy armor, and an unstoppable new hawk armor that was larger and more lethal than Black Hawks. This great beast opened its maws and tore into the northern border defenses of Great Liang, which were stretched thin over a vast length of thousands of kilometers. The Northwest descended into chaos. Without orders from the Marquis of Anding, their commander-in-chief, the Black Iron Battalion wouldn't dare retreat a single step, even if they were down to the last man. He Ronghui held the line for 3 bitter days and 2 nights, emptying their munitions, as the miraculous army forged over 3 generations was bled of almost half its men. It was then that Chang Geng's messenger arrived at last. With Gu Yuan's personal seal in hand, this mysterious commandery prince far off in the capital city had mimicked Gu Yuan's handwriting with flawless perfection. He gave the messenger 2 letters. If all was well on the border, the man was to deliver the first letter. The contents would order He Ronghui to ignore matters of the court, fill the violet gold stores in the western regions to full capacity immediately and by any means necessary, whether from the black market or elsewhere, tune up the garrison's armor, and be prepared for battle at any time. If fighting had already broken out on the border, the messenger was to deliver the second letter. The contents therein would instruct He Ronghui to avoid fighting to the death or drawing out the engagement, and to retreat to Jiayu Pass, some 100 kilometers to the east, at full speed and await reinforcements. Their hidden enemies had already made their move. It was undoubtedly too late to initiate an attack now. Chang Geng had no Black Hawks, and there was an extremely limited number of people whom he could contact using the Lingyuan Pavilion's wooden birds. Whether the sky should fall or the earth should collapse, it was unlikely that his message could arrive in time to stop it. Thus, he thought of the worst-case scenario and focused his efforts on repairing the pen after the sheep had escaped in hopes of preserving the rest of the flock. If fighting broke out in the western regions, it was unlikely the northern border would escape unscathed. Thus, while the Black Iron Battalion retreated to focus on defense, General Cai Bin received yet another letter from Chang Geng asking that he send reinforcements north and transport as much of the violet gold stored by his enormous army as he could to Jiayu Pass and thereby resolve their most pressing emergency. Chang Geng was well aware that if the worst were to happen, these few strategic moves were far from enough. He had no influence over the vast mountain range of the southwest. Shen Yi was there, but Shen Yi was a commander who had practically dropped from the sky with no connections or support to speak of. There was no way he could mobilize the army without a marching orders decree. Meanwhile, the Jiangnan Navy operating along the coast of the East Sea was even more of a headache. Zhao Youfang was Li Feng's man and would never respond to the summons of Gu Yuan's personal seal. Furthermore, Chang Geng had a certain premonition that even if he managed to run himself ragged, putting out fires everywhere else, a fatal blow was lurking within the vast expanses of the East Sea. The grievous news carried by the Black Hawk confirmed his worst suspicions. Chang Geng took a deep breath, released the last wooden bird, and turned to Huo Dan, who had developed a bloody blister at the corner of his mouth from stress. "Prepare the horses. I'm going to the imperial palace." Chang Geng was stopped by Liao Zhan right at the palace gates. The monk was dusty and travel-worn, but his visage exhibited his usual unruffled calm, as if even the most urgent emergency would melt within the neat rows of his incense scars. Liao Zhan pressed his hands together and bowed in greeting, then signed, "Amitabha Buddha, Your Highness." Chang Geng interrupted him, his voice indifferent. "Great Master, say no more. I'm going to plead on another's behalf, not force the Emperor's abdication." Liao Zhan's expression shifted slightly. "This humble monk trusts that Your Highness knows what lines should not be crossed." "It's not that I wouldn't cross the line." The silver-tongued fourth prince tore off his refined mask and spoke bluntly for once. "The Qinling mountain range splits the nation north and south. The territories of the southeast and southwest are not under our control. Even if I cut Li Feng down where I stood, I would be unable to ameliorate this crisis. On top of that, there is no one who can ascend the throne. The eldest prince is 9 years old, and the crown prince is younger still. The empress is a beautiful but useless invalid, and Cixi has no rightful claim. As for me," he scoffed, "I am the son of a barbarian enchantress." Liao Zhan looked at him, worry written plainly on his face. "Great Master, fret not. I am always a poisonous creature. If I was the slightest bit more capricious, I would, in all likelihood, have already brought disaster upon the nation and its people. But I haven't done anything at all yet, have I?" Chang Geng's expression smoothed, returning to its usual placidity. "Now isn't the time to speak of such things. Foreign enemies breach our borders as we speak, and theirs must be a plan long in the making. This isn't over yet. However, they reacted far too quickly. I suspect that someone in the palace, perhaps even someone attending Li Feng himself, has been liaising with our enemies. Does the Lingyuan Pavilion have anyone we can call upon in the palace?" Liao Zhan's expression became grave. He signed. "Your Highness means..." This involves an old case from 20 years ago and is most certainly connected to the northern barbarians. Investigate everyone the two barbarian women had contact with inside the palace. Every single person. The barbarian shamaness was a skilled wielder of poisons and had countless tricks up her sleeve. Leave no stone unturned. His voice was perfectly steady as he spoke of these two barbarian women, as if they had nothing to do with him. I should have found it strange a long time ago, Chang Geng said quietly. There must have been an extraordinary reason for Li Feng to so easily allow a tiger like Jiala Yinghuo to return to its lair. Unfortunately, he had been too young, and his fist-sized heart could then only hold a handful of youthful worries about leaving his home behind. If I were born 10 years earlier, Chang Geng suddenly began. Liao Ren's eyelid twitched. Chang Geng continued, word by word. This world would not be as we see today, nor would he have ever let go of Gu Yuan. Zishi once said that our dragon warships are 10 years behind our other military branches. I worry that war will break out in the East Sea. General Zhao is talented enough to build on the accomplishments of his predecessors, but he may not be capable of overseeing a great battle. Chang Geng explained briskly. I have already written a letter to Shifu. The Linyuan Pavilion's roots in Jiangnan run deep. Great Master, please take care of things on that end. I will be taking my leave. With that, he urged his horse forward and disappeared into the palace grounds. A rare frown creased Liao Zhan's brow. For some reason, hearing that Zishi from Chang Geng made his heart pound in terror. But there were more pressing matters at hand, and it wasn't the time to make a fuss over a simple name. The monk draped a rough linen robe over himself and melted into the light of dawn, racing off into the distance. The moment Chang Geng stepped into the palace, he was met with a flurry of bad news. Reports of the front lines, each more urgent than the last, caught the long-gone emperor and the officials of the court utterly unprepared. The Black Iron Battalion had retreated to Jiayu Pass. The northern border had lost 7 cities overnight, before Cai Bing's reinforcements could even set foot on the scene. As if the angry mobs on the southern border had been waiting for this day, they had coordinated with roving foreign bandits who had appeared out of nowhere and blown up the southwest supply depot. Report! Everyone in the great hall turned toward the door, face ashen. Li Feng hadn't even had the chance to allow Chang Geng to make his formal greeting. Urgent report, Your Majesty. A far western navy, 100,000 strong, has invaded from the Dongying archipelago. Li Feng's eyes nearly popped out of his head with fury. Where is Zhao Yofang? The messenger knocked his head against the floor. He spoke, voice choked with sobs. General Zhao has given his life for the nation. Chapter 58. A Blade Suspended. Li Feng swayed where he stood. Chang Geng watched expressionlessly as the emperor collapsed back onto the throne in his magnificent palace. Yet, from some part of his mind outside his rational control, a sudden wave of malicious glee rose within him. Of course, he was extremely disciplined and allowed it to persist for no more than a split second. He discreetly pinched himself on the palm and shoved that burst of bloodthirsty elation back down. He knew it was the Wu Ge meddling and not his true feelings. Take care, Your Majesty, Chang Geng said, not entirely sincerely. Now that Prince Yanbei had spoken, the dumbstruck officials in the great hall came to their senses and echoed, Take care, Your Majesty. Li Feng's gaze slowly shifted to consider Chang Geng. Nominally, Chang Geng was his only remaining brother, but Li Feng rarely took notice of him. Though His Highness, the 4th Prince Li Min, had received his title of nobility and started attending court, he rarely spoke up during court sessions, nor did he go out of his way to establish connections with other officials. He didn't even avail himself of Gu Yuan's influence to converse with military generals, and only occasionally made idle conversation about classic literature with a few poor and humble Hanlin scholars. Chang Geng seemed not to notice the emperor's attention as he continued steadily. Since General Zhao has given his life for the nation, we are now defenseless along the East Sea. If the Westerners turn their ships north, they'll be upon Dagu Harbor in an instant. Now that the situation has deteriorated to this point, it is too late for mere commentary to turn the tide. Your Majesty, please put aside distractions and make a decision on this matter with all haste. Naturally, Li Feng was aware of this, but with his mind an awful mess, he couldn't get a word out of his mouth. At this point, Imperial Uncle Wang, who had been so thoroughly disgraced by the rampant rumors, snuck a glance at the Emperor's expression, then plucked up his courage to offer a suggestion. Your Majesty, the official troops available to us in the area around the capital are those in the northern camp. We are surrounded by boundless inland plains easily traversed on horseback. If we make our stand here, our military forces will no doubt be insufficient. Moreover, the case of Tan Hongfei's rebellion remains open, and the northern camp has no leadership to speak of. If even the Dragon Navy in Jiangnan has been wiped out, is the disordered northern camp up to the task? Who has the capability to protect the safety of the imperial city? When it comes to our best way forward, why not, Wang Guo trailed off as every general in the Great Hall nailed their gazes into him like a volley of Parhelion arrows. This old bastard hadn't even finished wiping his own ass. How dare he have the nerve to urge the emperor to move the capital at the slightest whiff of trouble? If not for the fact that they were at present plagued by threats, both within and without, everyone in the room probably would have wanted to chop him up and eat him. Wang Guo gulped, defeated, then bent over in a bow and did not straighten up again. Li Feng's expression went gloomy and unreadable. After a few beats of silence, he ignored Imperial Uncle Wang and spoke. Restore Tan Hongfei to his position and give him a chance to redeem himself with meritorious service. We summoned you here to discuss business. Anyone who spouts any more bullshit can fuck off. In his rage, a street curse slipped from the emperor's mouth. The great hall went wholly silent, and Wang Guo's face flashed red and pale in turns. Li Feng turned irritably toward the Minister of War. My dear subject Hu, you oversee the Ministry of War and wield authority over the Marching Orders Decree. What are your thoughts? The Minister of War was born with a sickly, greenish complexion and a long face. His name, Hu Guang, was pronounced somewhat like Hu Gua or Calabash Gourd. Thus, people called him Minister Calabash in private. Upon hearing Li Feng call on him, Minister Calabash strained his mind so hard, bumps appeared all over his face and turned him into a bitter gourd. In theory, marching orders decrees were issued by the Ministry of War, but did they dare hand them out right and left? In practice, he was but a brush in the emperor's hand. Since when did a brush have the audacity to harbor its own opinions? Hu Guang wiped at the sweat on his brow and began indifferently. Your Majesty is quite correct. The capital is the foundation of the fate of our great Liang. It is the guiding light upon which all the people of the nation gaze. How can we allow those hairy foreigners to barge in it as well? Absurd! So long as one soldier remains, we must fight to the bitter end. If we sound the drums of retreat now, will the hearts of our soldiers not falter? Li Feng had no patience for his prattle and cut him off there. I'm asking you to give us a battle plan. Hu Guang fell silent. Everyone had glowered at Wang Guo, but Wang Guo was right. If the commander-in-chief of the Jiangnan Navy had already given his life for the nation, who would direct the battle along the coast of the East Sea? With their dragon navy scattered, how would they deploy troops? If the Westerners turned their sights on the north, how many rounds of cannon fire could the northern camp and the Imperial Guard repel? On some level, Wang Guo could be considered courageous. At the very least, he had spoken a truth no one else dared voice. Hu Guang was rapidly turning into a rotten, bitter gourd as sweat rolled down his face like rancid fluid leaking from spoiled produce. It was then that Chang Geng stepped forward. Your Majesty, may I speak? Asked the youthful Prince Yanbei. Hu Guang cast Chang Geng a look of gratitude. Chang Geng offered him an elegant smile, and his tone softened slightly. Your Majesty, spilt water cannot be recovered, and the dead cannot return to life. The sorry state of our four borders is established fact, and arguments and anger will do nothing to change our circumstances. Instead of sowing chaos within our own house, we ought to consider which of our weaknesses can yet be addressed. This young man must have spent too long a time in the company of monks. Not a trace of earthly mundanity lingered in his aura. He stood at the front of the hall like a jade tree in the wind, emanating a steady calm that could soothe a person down to the bone. Just the sight of him was enough to snuff out any roaring flame of fury. Li Feng sighed quietly and waved for him to continue. Speak. Fire blazes at all four corners of our nation. Our military forces have already mobilized, but have yet to be properly provisioned. To avoid further delay in supplying our troops, the subject requests Your Majesty open the national treasury and distribute all the violet gold therein. This is my first request. That's right. You've reminded us. Li Feng turned to the representatives of the Ministry of Revenue. Give the orders to do as he says. Your Majesty, Chang Geng continued, unhurried. This subject said to distribute all of it. This is a national emergency, and the marching orders decree has become a hindrance, shackling our generals' claws and teeth. Does Your Majesty truly wish to order them to the battlefield in chains? If anyone else had uttered these words, it would have been a profound offense. But for some reason, it was impossible to grow angry when they came from Prince Yanbei's mouth. Hu Guang, who had been abandoned to the side, hastened to add, This subject agrees. Before Li Feng could agree or dissent, the Ministry of Revenue exploded. The Assistant Minister of Revenue called out, Your Majesty, you mustn't. Distributing violet gold now will indeed address the most urgent of our problems. But if you'll permit this subject to speak an unpleasant truth, if we get through today, what will we do in the future? Eat next year's food? Han Qi, the captain of the Imperial Guard, likely very much wanted to twist off the assistant minister's head so he could dump out the cotton wool inside. He shot back, The bandits are at our doorstep, yet you ministers are still fiddling with your abacuses, wondering how we will make a living. This lowly general has truly seen something novel today. Your Majesty, if we don't address our most pressing issue now, what future will there be to speak of? If enemies hem us in on all sides, even digging up every centimeter of the meager violet gold veins within our borders won't be enough for our needs. As if afraid he wouldn't get a chance to talk, Hu Guang cut in once again, face flushed and neck bulging with fury. This subject agrees. Chang Geng hadn't yet said a word about how to fend off their enemies, and already he had incited a fierce quarrel. He, however, spoke no further, but stood patiently to the side and waited for their arguments to reach a conclusion. Li Feng's head was about to crack open. He suddenly felt that all the so-called pillars of the court were entirely fixated on the tiny patches of grass of their own backyards, and that the long-term pictures they were considering, when pieced together, created a tableau smaller than the size of a bowl. If their squabbling grew any more heated, he might as well send them to the imperial kitchens and dispense with the stoves. Maybe there they could fry up an impressive table of dazzling new dishes from a hitherto unknown cuisine. Enough! Li Feng roared. Everyone in the hall fell silent, other than Chang Geng, who now slipped back in to continue his speech. The subject is not finished. My second request is that Your Majesty be prepared to order a retreat. At this, the officials exploded once more. Even the Son of Heaven's rage couldn't stop this pot from boiling over, and even some of the older ministers looked to be on the verge of bashing their heads into the pillars to demonstrate their resolve. The corner of Li Feng's eye twitched. Fury surged up in his throat, and he barely managed to suppress it in time to avoid lashing out at Chang Geng. He grimaced like he was choking on his anger and issued a soft warning. I mean, there are certain things you should not say without thought. Our ancestors did not pass the nation into our hands to have us cede territory to tigers' jaws. Chang Geng's composure didn't flicker a mote. This subject asks Your Majesty to feel the fullness of his own purse. Even if we exhaust the strength of our nation, how large a territory can our court support? This is not a ceding of our land to tigers' jaws, but a brave warrior severing its own hand at the wrist to avoid dying from snake venom. if we are not decisive. If we do not make this sacrifice of our own volition, we will be forced to make it when the venom has sunk into the marrow and the nation has been overtaken by the Westerners. His voice, which was as serene as if he were merely reciting the Analects, was like a merciless bowl of ice water dumped over Li Feng's head. Chang Geng didn't look up to read the emperor's expression. He pressed on. As for my third request, Imperial Uncle Wang is correct. The Northwest is under the aegis of the Black Iron Battalion. Even if their losses are heavy, they will hold. The most urgent front is the coast of the East Sea. Once the Westerners advance north, they will meet the northern camp, whose battle capabilities are cause for concern. All possible reinforcements, near and far, are tied up elsewhere and may not arrive in time. Your Majesty, what are your plans when that time comes? These words aged Li Feng 10 years in an instant. He sat slumped in defeat for a long interval before he finally spoke again. We proclaim an imperial edict. Bring uncle to us. Chang Geng didn't so much as blink at the edict. He showed neither joy nor resentment, as if this was both wholly expected and well within reason. Afraid to even breathe out loud, Zhu Xiaojiao accepted the edict and turned to leave when Chang Geng spoke up again with a reminder. Your Majesty, isn't it rather belittling to have Zhu Gonggong declare an imperial edict to summon a prisoner from the imperial dungeons without an official of the court present? He had begun to distrust every one of Li Feng's attendants out of instinct, including this person who had nominally been helping Gu Yuan from the shadows all the time. Li Feng was exhausted. What times are these for you to care so much for hollow rules of etiquette? My dear subject Jiang, please make the trip on our behalf. Zhu Xiaojiao tottered after Jiang Chong on tiny steps. He unconsciously snuck a glance back at Chang Geng from afar. The eunuch was a veteran of the palace and was familiar with every noble and minister active in Great Liang's court. This Prince Yanbei was the lone exception. Gu Yuan had kept him sealed up tight in the Marquis estate since youth, and after he grew, he ignored his proper duties to travel all over the nation and rarely showed his face. He stood amid the crowd to attend court and listen to the proceedings, but rarely entered the palace on his own. He only accompanied Gu Yuan to pay his respects during the year-end holidays. No one knew anything about him. They knew nothing about him, and thus he was an unknown variable. Jiang Chong and Zhu Xiaojiao exited the palace and rode for the imperial dungeons with all speed. Just as they were practically upon them, Zhu Xiaojiao had a sudden thought and spoke up in his pinched voice. Wait, Justice Yang, how improper would it be for the Marquis to have an audience with the Emperor in a prisoner's uniform? Why don't I send someone to look through the newly made court uniforms for marquises of the first rank and bring one over? Jiang Chong's mind was filled with grief and indignation for the catastrophes devastating his nation. When his soul was summoned back to his body by the old eunuch's words, he was so flabbergasted he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Zhu Gonggong, you're still worrying about such trifles at a time like this? Before he could finish, he spied a rider galloping in their direction. The newcomer soon arrived before them and dismounted to offer a formal salute to a superior. It was the captain of the Marquis Estate's Guard, Huo Dan. Huo Dan quickly cupped his fist in his hand. Justice Yang, Zhu Gonggong, I am the servant of the Marquis of Anding's estate. Our prince ordered me to bring these for the Marquis. He ordered... Oh, God. I'm so sorry, you guys. He offered up a set of court robes and armor with both hands. Jiang Chong's heart stirred. Prince Yanbei was clearly a meticulous person, but what reason was there for him to mind the fine details to this extent? Whom was this prince guarding against? In the imperial dungeons, Gu Yuan was dangling that plump rat by the tail out of sheer boredom, making it swing around in midair. Sensing a shift in the flow of air behind him, he turned, a bit shocked, and saw the vague silhouettes of 3 people charge in from outside. The first person swept forward like the wind and seemed to be wearing court robes. Seconds later, the lock on the cell door swung open, and the unique scent of court incense entered Gu Yuan's nose along with the scent of Li Feng's personal sandalwood fragrance. Squinting, Guyuan managed to recognize the thick-waisted man as Zhu Xiaojiao. If these people were here to interrogate him, there was no reason to send Zhu Xiaojiao. But Li Feng wasn't the type to make a fool of himself by declaring two contradictory edicts in such quick succession, locking Gu Yuan up only to let him go the next moment. In that case, the only remaining possibility... The smile slid off Gu Yuan's face. What now? Jiang Chong uttered a stream of rapid syllables. Gu Yuan could barely hear him and only vaguely caught the words enemy, invasion, Zhao, and nothing else. Hopelessly confused, he could only affect a visage of impenetrable calm and nod, the picture of an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. Infected by his stoic mien, Jiang Chong was at once greatly reassured. His emotions that had swung drastically between anxiety and sorrow finally settled back within his stomach, and he well-nigh burst into tears on the spot. Having a pillar like the Marquis is truly a blessing upon Great Liang and its people. Gu Yuan was baffled. Shit, what is he saying now? But on the surface, he only gave Justice Jiang a brief pat on the shoulder and a terse instruction. Lead the way. Fortunately, at this point, Huo Dan stepped forward, and he presented Gu Yuan with his court robes. He retrieved a wine flask from his hip. Your Highness requested I bring this to my lord to relieve the chill. Gu Yuan opened the lid. One sniff was all he needed to tell it was medicine. He exhaled a sigh of relief, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and drained the flask in a single draught. With Huo Dan's help, he changed with great efficiency. At least now he looked more or less presentable. Their party raced straight to the palace. The deaf-blind Marquis of Anding fumbled his way along in their midst, wishing more than ever that the medicine would take effect quickly. Gu Yuan's hearing finally began to improve with needle-like stabs of pain as he reached the palace walls. He gave Huo Dan a discreet hand signal. Immediately taking his meaning, Huo Dan stepped forward, leaned into his ear, and repeated every word Jiang Chong had said to him in the imperial dungeons. As Gu Yuan listened to his account, something seemed to snap inside his head, which was already close to bursting with a headache. An explosion of golden sparks swirled before his eyes, and he stumbled before Huo Dan caught him by the arm. Sir! Jiang Chong jumped in alarm. The Marquis of Anding had been a model of near-inhuman calmness moments ago. What had happened? Seeing Gu Yuan as pale as the dead, he asked anxiously, My lord, what's wrong? The Black Iron Battalion suffered casualties of more than half their number. Passes along the northern border fell into enemy hands in quick succession. General Zhao has given his life for the nation. The Southwest Supply Depot has been bombed. Each of these brief reports became a lethal blade that twisted its way into Gu Yuan's flesh and bone. Pain pierced his chest, and the taste of iron flooded his throat. Veins popped from Gu Yuan's forehead, and sweat trickled down his temples. His eyes seemed to lose focus. Jiang Chong knew no one would dare torture the Marquis of Anding, even if he were in the imperial dungeons, but he was still profoundly frightened. What's wrong with the Marquis? Should I summon a sedan? The imperial doctors? Gu Yuan's body swayed slightly. My lord, the safety of Great Liang rests on your shoulders. We can't afford to lose you now, Jiang Chong cried out. His words were like a crack of thunder in Gu Yuan's ear. The scattered pieces of his soul shuddered, then wrenched themselves back into that extraordinarily resilient iron spine. Gu Yuan closed his eyes and determinedly swallowed a mouthful of blood. After a beat, he laughed hoarsely under Jiang Chong's trepidatious gaze as if nothing were wrong. I haven't seen the sun in a few days, so I have a slight headache. It's no matter. A long-standing affliction. As Gu Yuan spoke, he bowed his head and straightened the light armor on his body. He tugged his arm out of Huo Dan's grasp and tossed him the gray rat that had been curled in his palm since they left the prison. This is my rat brother and closest confidant. Get him something to eat. Don't let him starve. With that, he turned and strode into the palace. In the great audience hall, those few words from Chang Geng had sparked a verbal brawl. But when Zhu Xiaojiao's ringing voice called out the words, The Marquis of Anding has arrived at the palace for an audience with the emperor, everyone held their fire. and a deathly silence settled over the hall. As soon as Gu Yuan lifted his head, he met Chang Geng's gaze. They locked eyes only briefly before glancing away, but Gu Yuan did not miss the storm of unspeakable words swirling in Chang Geng's eyes. Gu Yuan stepped forward to bow in greeting to the emperor as if they were the only two in the room, so indifferent he might have just woken from a nap in the marquis estate rather than been pulled from the imperial dungeons. Li Feng at once declared an end to the court session and kicked out every mouthy debater and useless sponge, leaving only Gu Yuan, Chang Geng, and the senior military officials to discuss adjustments to the capital city's defenses through the night. Master Feng Han, who had been reflecting on his behavior at home, was called forth from his hermitage once again, and the Lingshu Institute was soon awash in lamplight, working overtime to tune up every piece of the capital's available equipment. Li Feng, dark smudges beneath his eyes, kept them hopping for a whole day and night, all through the fourth night watch, until the sky began to pale along the horizon. On their way out, Li Feng called for Gu Yuan alone to stay behind. All others had been dismissed from the Great Wall, leaving only one lord and one subject, face to face. Li Feng was silent for a long while, until the palace lamps sensed the sunlight and extinguished themselves with a click, startling him back to his senses. He regarded Gu Yuan with a complicated expression, then said vaguely, "Uncle has suffered a grievance." Gu Yuan had a bellyful of well-worn niceties that he could spout without a second thought. "Furious thunder and gentle rain are both an honor coming from my sovereign. There is no reason to feel aggrieved over dying for the nation," and other nonsense of that type had already strung itself seamlessly together beneath his silver tongue. But all of a sudden, it was as if that silver tongue had rusted over. No matter how he tried, he couldn't utter a word. He could only smile in the Long-An Emperor's direction. It was a peculiarly stiff smile, a bit awkward in its presentation. The two of them really had nothing to say to each other. Li Feng sighed and waved him off. Head bowed deferentially, Gu Yuan took his leave. Chapter 59. Entering Battle. When Gu Yuan exited the Great Hall, his vision was beginning to blur. He let nothing of it show as he stood and gasped in a few breaths. For the first time in his life, he felt crushed under the weight of the paltry few dozen kilograms of light armor he wore. In times of emergency, a person's latent potential seemed infinite. In the palace, Gu Yuan had worked straight through the headache that was usually unbearable even with acupuncture and a bed to lie on for the entire day and night without thinking twice. But as soon as he stepped outside, he discovered that his body was on the verge of collapse, his clothes practically plastered to his skin. The faint breeze carried a trace of morning dew, and he shivered with cold as it blew past, his head spinning. Earlier there had been a glimmer of sunlight, but dark clouds had covered it in the blink of an eye, leaving the dawn weak and pale. Chang Geng was waiting for him at the door, facing away from the endless layers of the palace, laid out building upon building like the realm of immortals. The hem of Prince Yanbei's court robes fluttered in the wind, and he stared in the direction of Kite's flight pavilion, lost in thought. Chang Geng only turned when he heard the pad of footsteps behind him. As soon as he saw Gu Yuan's complexion, he frowned. "The carriage is waiting outside. You can rest on the way." Deeply exhausted in body and mind, Gu Yuan mumbled a thoughtless hum of assent. "What did that guy keep you behind to discuss?" "Idle chatter." "Nonsense," Gu Yuan said woodenly. Chang Geng saw he hadn't the energy to talk, so he held his tongue the whole way back to the marquis estate. Countless arrow tokens of command had been distributed that morning, and all 6 ministries would have to dance to their tune. They both understood this might be their only opportunity to rest for some time. Gu Yuan's knees went weak the instant he stepped into his room, and he stumbled over to collapse on the couch. He had yet to remove his armor, and as he crashed down with a clang, half of his body went numb and the ceiling spun above his head. Gu Yuan suspected he might never be able to get up again. Chang Geng pressed his fingers to Gu Yuan's wrist and took his pulse. Those hands, which had been icy cold some minutes ago, were now frightfully hot. as if they had been freshly fished from the brazier. Yifu, when did you get a fever? Guyuan let out a quiet groan. Aches seeped from every joint, and his eyelids were so heavy he could no longer lift them. He struggled to find his voice. Is my little brother still in good health? Who? Asked Chang Geng. Huodan, who was following them closely, made a prompt sound of assent and produced that little gray rat, which was indeed still alive and kicking. Sir, he's doing perfectly well. Then I should be fine too, said Guyuan, lethargic with illness, and lurched back to his feet under the power of his own strength. He allowed those around him to remove his armor in a flurry of limbs, then roughly swept his sweat-soaked hair out of his face. I either have a cold or an excess of internal heat. It'll pass. I only need to take some medicine and sweat it out. Huodan stood to the side in befuddlement, unsure when his marquis had tied his life to that of a common gray rat. Chang Geng, however, understood at once, and his gaze flickered slightly. He pressed Guyuan down on the couch to stop his fidgeting. Leave it to me. Chang Geng dismissed Huodan and personally peeled Guyuan out of his clothes, which were so wet one could wring water from them. Guyuan's entire body was limp, and simply opening his eyes made him dizzy. So he could do nothing but keep them closed, slumped over, and let Chang Geng manhandle him as he pleased. Guyuan's breathing was unusually fast, and for some reason he looked rather frail. Once his outer and middle layers had been removed, Chang Geng's hands inadvertently trembled. Guyuan's thin inner robe was soaked through with sweat. It concealed about as much of what lay beneath as a layer of garlic skin. Just enough of his chest and waistline showed through that it would have been less suggestive had he been completely naked. Somehow, Chang Geng found this sight even more lethal than the time Guyuan had jumped into the hot spring before his very eyes. Chang Geng's heart pounded like thunder in his chest. He didn't dare remove more of Guyuan's clothes, so he dragged the blankets over from the bed and hastily wrapped them around Guyuan's body. He dug out a set of clean clothing and placed it beside him, then said, a note of pleading in his voice, Yifu, do the rest yourself, okay? Guyuan had seldom fallen sick after reaching adulthood, which made this rare exception seem all the more serious. He was so hot it felt as if smoke were pouring from his 7 orifices, and his ears rang without cease. At these words, he gestured weakly at Chang Geng and grumbled, Of all times to... You're really something else. Chang Geng stood to the side, head bowed. Infected by his embarrassment, Guyuan too began to feel self-conscious, and neither of them spoke for a long interval. Chang Geng finally awkwardly broke the silence. I'll go prepare your medicine. He turned on his heel and left, allowing both to let out a sigh of relief. Guyuan lay still for a while, thoughts melting into a pot of congee under the heat of his fever. Everything mixed together. First it was, what exactly am I to do with this little brat? Then it was, the Black Iron Battalion has retreated to Jiayu Pass. No one will retrieve the bodies of our fallen brothers, even if only to bring them back wrapped in horsehide. As his thoughts ran on in this manner, a cavernous hole yawned in his heart, leaving him vulnerable to every gust of bleak wind and wretched rain. All the heartbreak that had been shoved down by a few alarmed words from Jiang Chong as they rode toward the palace came roaring back with a vengeance, leaving him in such anguish he wished he were dead. Half of a force of 50,000 iron-armed soldiers, lost in one night. In the end, Guyuan's consciousness faded. Rather than fall asleep, it was more like he fainted dead away. His thoughts were murky. They drifted between dream and waking, segments from the past and present knotting together in an inextricable tangle. As his consciousness slid down these threads, memories from the long-ago past flashed before his eyes one by one. He recalled that when he was still young, in those years when he was neither blind nor deaf, he was like a jumping flea that couldn't be beaten into submission. Whenever the old Marquis laid eyes on him, he would huff and glare in fury. But once, there was a day when the old Marquis discovered a rare reservoir of patience and took his son to see the sunset beyond the pass. The old Marquis was tall and broad and strict in conduct. and treated his young son, who was still the size of a dumpling, just the same. He refused to pick him up. Reluctantly leading him by the hand was the extent of the old Marquis's limited paternal affection. This arrangement forced the adult to bend at his waist and lean to the side, and the child to stretch his arm up as high as he could. It was uncomfortable for all involved. But Gu Yuan didn't complain. It was the first time he had seen the setting sun paint the desert beyond this border town the color of blood. The figure of the Black Hawk swept across the sky like a golden crow, dragging a Parhelion tail behind it, and yellow sands and silent flatland groves spread as far as the eye could see. The young Gu Yuan was awed by the sight. They watched until the great red disk of the sun sank below the horizon, and Gu Yuan heard the old Marquis say to his deputy general, who was standing beside him, "As a soldier, becoming a sacrifice of the nation can also be a lifetime's greatest fortune." Back then, he hadn't understood, but 20 years had passed. "Marshal," Gu Yuan thought through the haze, "looks like I will really become a sacrifice of this nation." Like a swift steed galloping past a crack in the wall, a spark from a stone, a figure within a dream. Not long after, someone stepped through the door. He raised Gu Yuan to a seated position and held the bowl of water to his lips. That person was surpassingly gentle, as if he were long accustomed to taking care of others, and didn't spill so much as a drop. After he finished helping Gu Yuan drink, he murmured coaxingly into his ear, "Zishi, take your medicine before you sleep." Gu Yuan mumbled without opening his eyes. 1 hour. Wake me up in 1 hour. Pour cold water on my face if I don't get up." Chang Geng sighed, fed him the medicine without a word, then took a seat at the side to watch over him. Gu Yuan appeared to be uncomfortable. He tossed and turned, nearly kicking off all his blankets. Chang Geng replaced the covers a few times, then gave up and wrapped Gu Yuan in the blankets completely before pulling him into his arms. Perhaps it was because Gu Yuan hadn't been especially intimate with anyone since childhood, but strangely, he settled down as soon as he felt another pressed up behind him. The person holding him even considerately arranged him in the most comfortable position. Miss Chun's pacifying fragrance filled his nose, and a hand stroked his forehead with a perfect amount of pressure, then massaged his forehead, shoulders, and neck. Gu Yuan had never slept on such a comfortable bed in his life. He quickly drifted off, content as could be. The quiet minutes swept by like fast-flowing water, and an hour passed in the blink of an eye. Chang Geng glanced at the nearby table clock, truly reluctant to do as Gu Yuan asked, both reluctant to let go of Gu Yuan and reluctant to wake him. But there was nothing to be done. This disastrous battle was already upon them. In all the world, was there a single place Gu Yuan could sleep in peace? Chang Geng stilled himself and lightly flicked one of Gu Yuan's acupoints, waking him right on schedule. As Gu Yuan's consciousness returned, Chang Geng rose and headed to the kitchen. Gu Yuan's mind had remained on high alert the whole time. With a bowl of medicine and some time to sweat it out, he managed to fend off his illness by sheer willpower. After an hour of rest, his fever had mostly receded. He lay on the bed for some minutes, then got up and put on his clean clothes. He felt like he had come back to life. With his body on the mend, his mind was also much more at ease. They're just a bunch of foreigners, aren't they? If they were really so omnipotent, would they need all these plots and schemes? No matter how dire the present circumstances, he was still alive. As long as the Gu family had a member remaining, the Black Iron Battalion had not fallen. At this thought, Gu Yuan let out a long sigh. Only then did he realize he was so hungry that his belly was practically flat against his back. He rubbed his stomach in misery and thought to himself, "If someone brought me a couple of Shaobing flatbreads right now, I swear to heaven, I'd marry them on the spot." Oh, don't say that. Oh, God. Chang Geng entered just then, bearing a bowl of hot noodle soup. The steamy aroma slapped Gu Yuan in the face without a trace of politeness. He was so hungry, his innards were twisting themselves into a knot. Gu Yuan could only gloomily eat his words. "This is an exception. This doesn't count. The moment he thought this, there came a timely clap of muddled thunder in the distance. Guyun remained silent. Chang Geng reached out to check his temperature. Your fever's gone. Yifu, come eat something first. Guyun accepted the chopsticks wordlessly. When he heard the word Yifu, something stirred in his heart. He felt that something was off, but before he could grasp what it was, the thought vanished, flitting away in an instant. You made this? Guyun asked. I was a little short on time, so I only tossed some noodles in a pot, Chang Geng said, his face unchanging. You'll have to make do. Guyun suddenly felt rather uncomfortable. He had no idea why the illustrious Prince Yenbei was acting like some virtuous wife. Chang Geng seemed to sense his thoughts. If the country falls, I'll off Li Feng and open a noodle house in the northwest. It'll be enough to live on, he said evenly. Guyuan choked on a mouthful of soup, choking so hard he nearly keeled over. Laughing, Chang Geng said, I'm joking. Guyuan picked up a cup of herbal tea and gulped it down. What a good child you are. You've learned to play me for laughs, I see. You're getting more and more out of hand. Chang Geng's expression turned solemn. Back in Yanhui Town, when you told me you were going to bring me back to the capital, I had actually planned to run away. I thought I'd either head deep into the mountain forests and become a hunter, or find some tiny border town and open a barely profitable shop, just enough to scrape by. But in the end, I figured I probably wouldn't be able to slip away under your nose, so I settled down. Guyuan pushed the vegetables to the side and scooped up the ham from the bottom of the bowl to eat first. He was still chewing when Chang Geng suddenly leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. Yifu, you don't know this, but every day you fail to appear before me safe and sound is a day I dare not close my eyes and sleep. At last, I'm far from safe and sound right now. Guyuan cut in tonelessly. Give me an update on the current state of affairs. Chang Geng understood at once that he meant the things Chang Geng couldn't mention in Li Feng's presence. You're the one who called for the Black Iron Battalion to retreat, Guyuan said. Otherwise, He Zhonghui and the others might very well have fought to the last man. I forged your handwriting, Chang Geng said. I ordered the Black Iron Battalion to retreat to Jiayu Pass. Then I asked General Cai Bin to lead reinforcements north to assist along the border. Considering how much time has passed, the emergency stores of violet gold in General He's hands have likely already been depleted. But Li Feng doesn't need to know about any of these matters. In any case, he's already abolished the marching orders decree. Gu Yuan blinked. You know how to forge. It's just a bit of trickery. Chang Geng shook his head. As for Jiangnan, I sent a letter to Shifu, but I was too late. I also suspect that the Northern Barbarians operatives from 20 years ago are still within the palace. I've entrusted an ally with the investigation. As for General Shen, there's been no word from him yet, but I'm afraid that when it comes, it won't be good news. No news is good news. Gu Yuan fell silent for a short while, then continued. That old maid was born under a lucky star. There's no way he'll die. Yifu, although the assault on the northwest front came from a furious rush, the situation there appears to be stable now. Do you think we'll be able to hold the capital after the disaster of the East Sea? Guyuan glanced up at him, his eyes like flint, cold and unspeakably hard, yet capable of producing sparks at the slightest contact. He and Chang Geng were the only two people in the room, a bowl of noodles between them. Guyuan didn't bother equivocating and answered him honestly. This will depend on whether we can hold out until reinforcements arrive. After traveling all this way, the foreigners want to end this quickly too. Otherwise, they wouldn't have opened with such a spectacle. The longer we drag this out, the greater our advantage. However, Great Liang did not have the strength to wage war of attrition. Li Feng lost his mind trying to obtain Lolan's violet gold reservoirs because, despite being the most bountiful nation with the richest resources in the world, there was very little violet gold to be excavated in Great Liang. Supply failed to meet demand. Nearly 40% of the violet gold in Great Liang came in the form of tributes from the 18 tribes. Another large portion came from assorted purchases from foreign nations. It was in this way that the money flowing in from maritime trade flowed right back out. Now, with the 18 tribes rebelling and all four borders under siege, they could only make use of the violet gold they already had in reserve. Before long, they would struggle to make ends meet. And that was only violet gold. What about supplies, provisions? Where could the impoverished national treasury, which was presently leaner than a daylily, possibly find that much cash? Guyun continued in a low voice. Just as you said, if we run out of options, we can pull back every military force in the country and hunker down while we formulate a plan. That would certainly be the most rational way to proceed. But such a thing may not be possible. The Black Iron Battalion's retreat to Jiayu Pass is already water under the bridge. Though the region beyond the Western Pass is usually incredibly lively, most of those who frequent the area are itinerant merchants. The Silk Road has only been open a few years, not enough time for people to settle down. After tensions rose around the new year and the passes were closed, most of these people likely saw there was no business to conduct and moved on. But the same cannot be said of the regions inside the pass. There are thousands of villages, tens of thousands of families, and millions upon millions of people living there. Hu Zhonghui cannot retreat any farther even if his body is hacked into 10,000 pieces. The Black Iron Battalion held up the people of Great Liang's faith in their keeping. They were the backbone of the nation. If that backbone were to snap, what point was there in fighting on? They may as well change the nation's name and be done with it. After a beat, Chang Geng said, I meant as a last resort. There is no last resort, Guyuan shook his head. You are far-sighted and astute. You know how to govern a country, but you have never fought a war. I'm telling you, when it comes to war, aside from temporal and topographical considerations, two factors remain. One is equipment such as steam engines and steel armor. The other is courage in the hearts of soldiers who have no fear of death. With regard to our equipment, it is what it is. There's nothing we can do at this point. But it is my belief that even if the foreigners are strong, they're not so much stronger than we are. And that's not even getting into those barbarian bumpkins who use cannons like cudgels. My subordinates are people, not chess pieces. They are brave, but they also fear death. Do you remember what I told you back when we were fighting bandits in the southwest? I do, Chang Geng said. You told me, on the battlefield, whoever clings to life is the first to die. Guyuan hummed in muffled agreement. Even seeing their nation riddled with holes couldn't deter him from eating his fill. Over the course of their brief conversation, he had polished off the whole bowl of noodles. Finally, he held his nose and slurped those hateful leafy greens down alongside the last of the soup in one gulp. He didn't even bother to chew. Meal demolished, he set the bowl on the table. Is there more? No, I only made one bowl. You were just ill. Your stomach and spleen are still weak. 60 to 70% full is just right for you, Chang Geng said. As for how we fight, you're in charge. You don't have to worry about any future consequences, nor about the opinions of others. How to make money, how to obtain violet gold, how to coordinate and distribute resources. Leave it all up to me. Guyuan was slightly startled and laughed in spite of himself. I'm in charge of everything? What if I lose? Chang Geng smiled without a word, his eyes fixed intently on Guyuan like a pool of still water suddenly broken by a ripple. If eyes could speak, he would have clearly announced to the world, if you lose, I will share your burden of infamy for all eternity. If you die, I will accompany you in death. It was then that Huo Dan rapped lightly on the door. Sir, Master Feng Han and General Tan have arrived. They've brought the second military dispatch from the EC. Guyuan called out at once. Send them in. Chang Geng tucked away his gaze and tidied up the bowl and chopsticks. With his head lowered, he said, Just now, there was one thing I said that was complete nonsense. Guyuan started in surprise. I said the reason I didn't run away was because I thought I wouldn't be able to slip away under your nose. Chang Geng smiled without lifting his head. Back then, I was nothing more than a country boy from a tiny border town. I didn't think that far ahead at all. Guyuan had already astutely parsed his unspoken implication. Chang Geng, that's enough, he said, stern. Chang Geng obediently closed his mouth, swallowing the rest. At the time, he hadn't thought that far ahead at all. There was only one reason he didn't run away. There was one person whom he couldn't bear to let go. Tan Hongfei and Zhang Fenghan were soon led in, and the wax-sealed report from the front lines was presented to Gu Yun. As he handed it over, Tan Hongfei's hands trembled faintly. Gu Yun's heart sank. Sir, the report from Jiangnan says that our navy was routed and has been forced to retreat some 500 kilometers. The Westerners have already begun to sail north. The foreigners have some sort of new dragon warship. It's fast as lightning and 2 times larger than our naval dragons. And they're said to be escorted by a giant sea monster, Tan Hongfei said. If this report isn't unfounded nonsense, they'll reach Dagu Harbor in 2 or 3 days. That was a lot of a mess of 3 chapters to untangle. Sorry, 4 chapters to untangle. And we now see that, okay, war has broken out and things aren't really looking too good for Great Liang. And you know what? Even though there were the workings and schemings in secret by the Pope, Mr. Jia, and others like Jiala Yinghua, ultimately, it's really the Emperor's misstep that has led to all of this. From him, stopping the black market workings, or basically crunching down on that and making people more hesitant to purchase from the black market, to returning a tiger to its lair, being Jiala Yinghua, to imprisoning Gu Yuan, to the stuff with what's his name, He Tanfei. I can't remember his name at the moment. The general, Tan Hongfei. I'm gonna remember this guy's name. But all of these things accumulated, like the decisions that he made, have led up to this point. Not to say they wouldn't have faced adversities anyway, but I mean, the emperor has not made some good decisions ultimately. And it's just crazy because Chang Geng has really shown how much wisdom he has gained over the years. And it's crazy because a part of me is like, how the hell did you learn this stuff? We had that time jump where we didn't get the insights of his journey as he grew into a young man. But clearly, under his Shifu and under Chen Qingxu and just his journeys and great Master Liao Zhen and his journeying, he's clearly learned a lot of freaking stuff. And I know he's been sitting in the imperial court in meetings and stuff like that, even if he doesn't speak up a lot. And he's clearly literate and well-versed in literature. So it's just so nice to see how intellectual and wise he actually is, to even go up to the emperor and be like, hey, you need to do this, this, and this. And even forging letters in Gu Yuan's stead, if there was already fighting or if there was no fighting, what to do, what not to do. And he just has great foresight of him knowing he has to say certain things and the emperor will basically fall in line with what he said. Because he didn't have to say to the emperor, release Gu Yuan. He spoke in a manner that would only put the seed in the emperor's mind to release Gu Yuan. And again, with the foresight, he already had clothing prepared and the flask of his medicine. Like, sir, you are just, wow. I love Chang Geng's character a lot. And man, the other thing I'll say is, speaking of Chang Geng, on page 315, when he gave that analogy, my lover of poetry and just really profound writing self could just burst at the seams when he spoke on basically, they weren't handing the land over to tiger's jaws, but they were like someone who was bitten by a venomous snake and had to cut off their hand before the poison spread through the rest of the body. So he's like, we're not just completely giving up. We're basically doing what we need to do to survive, and then we can bide our time and figure out solutions for the future. Like, I absolutely loved that analogy that Priest made for him to give. And the other thing that was really funny, I think I giggled a little bit when it happened. I don't know if anyone else caught it, but I just thought Hu Guang's character was funny because he's the Ministry of War, but he didn't really know what to say. And then as Chang Geng and others were talking, he was like, this subject agrees. This subject agrees. This subject agrees. And it was just really funny to me. I was like, sounds like someone shouldn't have his job. So anything, I mean, anyway, that's pretty much all I can say. I enjoyed these chapters. I'm ready for the final three chapters before we move to the next book. So I hope you all have a good morning, evening, afternoon, set the times backwards, whatever. Well, I ain't even.